The Clark children's summers included vacationing in Canada with the Supreme Court legend Charles Evans Hughes, whom Clark jokingly called Old Brushface because of his famous bushy white whiskers. They met Admiral Richard Byrd, who spent 2 summers in Dublin preparing for his expeditions to Antarctica. Let me read that again. The Clark children's summers included vacationing in Canada with the Supreme Court legend Charles Evans Hughes, whom Clark jokingly called Old Brushface because of his famous bushy white whiskers. They met Admiral Richard Byrd, who spent 2 summers in Dublin preparing for his expeditions to Antarctica. Admiral Byrd was the one who went to Antarctica and supposedly fought what was down in Antarctica, non-human entities. And the whole story was that Admiral Byrd had to get out of there. You know how there's a whole mystery about Antarctica and about how there's supposedly like something called the tall grays are down there, and how Antarctica's off limits. Oh my God. The great variety of people who passed through the Clarks' homes and lives included governors, ambassadors, and influential journalists. The 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, editor, and political analyst Walter Lippmann was a good friend. The Clarks lunched regularly with Edith, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, at the former president's Sagamore Hill estate in nearby Oyster Bay. In fact, all the Theodore Roosevelt clan were friends of the Clarks. A post-war trip to London included dinner with British Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who in later years came to be Clark's close friend and strong collaborator on world peace through world law. One daughter's favorite celebrity moment was encountering Albert Einstein at a meeting of intellectuals gathered by her father at Princeton to work on the peace problem, as Clark always called it, quote unquote. The young girl had the unusual opportunity to rescue the brilliant scientist from falling down a hotel's narrow scullery stairwell, a memorable experience among so many others. From presidents to prime ministers to Albert Einstein, the children of Grenville Clark received an expansive liberal education. Both parents emphasized academics, and Grenville Clark was at the ready to personally tutor his children on topics from the most basic to esoteric if he detected a lack of basic knowledge. One daughter vividly recalled an impromptu lecture he gave on a cruise ship about differentiating the 3 branches of the U.S. government. The lesson was seared permanently, practically verbatim, into her memory. The child who, say, tossed an ancient Greek phrase into a conversation to show off could expect a sharp follow-up question. Is that all the Greek you know? It wouldn't be for long. Supplemental civics lessons included periodic trips to Washington, D.C. Like countless other school children, the Clark offspring were brought to the nation's capital to observe the hub of government firsthand, where law and politics, deals and ideals daily collide. Like other children, they explored the Smithsonian's wonders, toured the major government buildings, and perhaps chased each other around DC's imposing marble monuments. Unlike most children, however, the Clarks' Washington visits included private calls on senior senators and cabinet members with whom their father might be working on high-level projects, and lunching in the Supreme Court dining room with family friend Felix Frankfurter. When the court was not in session, the Clarks would be visiting Justice Benjamin Cardozo at his D.C. apartment. A handwritten note confirms. A visit from the Clark family will bring me pride and pleasure. I shall be at my apartment, which serves me also as an office, both morning and afternoon. Benjamin Cardozo. A visit to the home of the recently retired Justice Louis Brandeis, another highlight of the children's extracurricular civics agenda. One spring break even included a private call on President Franklin Roosevelt in the Oval Office, which surely made for a hard-to-beat summer vacation essay back at school. The family's after-dinner rituals often included Grenville Clark's reading aloud to the children Uncle Remus, Kipling, Sir Walter Scott, and especially Shakespeare. All were rendered with dramatic flair, complete with outrageous accents and full empathic gestures, or he would regale the young people with tales of his own adventures, grizzly bears he encountered on hunting trips in the Rockies, or mischievous anecdotes from Pomfret School or Harvard days. The family also played parlor games, including Fanny's childhood favorite of charades in front of the nearly constantly burning low fire in the living room. The Clarks celebrated holidays with enthusiasm and mountains of gifts. Grenville Clark was an irrepressible gift giver, often to the chagrin of frugal Fanny. Apparently, he was also a last-minute shopper. Daughter Mary recalled that each Christmas Eve, presumably on her busy father's way home from Wall Street, Abercrombie and Fitch was assaulted by him in remarkable style. I didn't even know Abercrombie and Fitch was like around in the fucking 1800s. A short LIRR ride later, the top-coated Santa would burst through the front door loaded with gifts. Louisa, the youngest child, was in charge of writing the annual family Christmas epic, recounting in rhyming verse the year's adventures by all Clarks. These ran several legal pages and were read aloud with all the children piled onto their parents' bed on Christmas morning on Long Island. Another Christmas time ritual was reading Dickens' A Christmas Carol aloud before the fire on Christmas Eve, with Pete Clark's voice becoming increasingly unsteady as the story neared its poignant ending. Mary D. carried on that tradition, reading the holiday classic aloud to her own family on Christmas Eve. Every year she cried. The Clarks took regular vacations together within America and around the world. In addition to the annual summer stretch in Dublin, New Hampshire, they took regular jaunts to the former Cannon estate in Burlington, Vermont, where Grenville's brother Julian still lived, and to Boston to spend time with Fanny's family. The family enjoyed lengthy cruises to the Caribbean, South America, Scandinavia, and Russia, and winter escapes from bitter New England weather to country club resorts in Florida and Arizona. But even as seemingly charmed a life as the Clarks does not come without some measure of sorrow. Grenville and Fanny's second decade together was wrenched by a double tragedy. In November 1922, their beloved firstborn daughter, Eleanor, contracted meningitis and died at age 7. In cruelly rapid succession came a stillborn son, Dwight, in 1923. A sensitive and deeply caring man, the stricken Grenville Clark wore a black mourning band on the arm of his business suits for a year. The children's deaths came during an already sobering time for the nation. In January 1919, the seemingly invincible former president Theodore Roosevelt had died in his sleep of a blood clot to the lungs. The grief provoked among TR's national and even international army of followers was intense and sustained. For Clark, it was a personal blow. Roosevelt had been a close friend, an early mentor. One historian called Teddy Roosevelt's death a prelude to the disappointment and disillusionment that pervaded practically all of America in the years immediately following the World War. There was also a lingering malaise from crushed hopes for a lasting peace after the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Instead of resolving past differences after World War I, the conference produced the Treaty of Versailles, which fucked Germany completely, which actually created new ones by carving vast conquered territories of the defeated Ottoman Empire into colonies, euphemistically called mandates, for the victors sowing seeds of sectarian conflict in the Middle East and North Africa that reverberate to this day. In a final blow to the exhausted, embittered, and increasingly invalided President Wilson, his own government would ultimately reject his cherished League of Nations. Unlike most of his conservative contemporaries, in a foreshadowing of his later work for world peace, Grenville Clark was a strong supporter of the League. Across the country, the wartime boom had collapsed, and in its place came riots, strikes, and the Red Scare. And though no one yet knew it, things would only get worse, much worse, as the superheated stock market boom of the mid-1920s set up its spectacular 1929 crash into the Great Depression. Through it all, Clark maintained his relentless work ethic. He vigorously practiced law, took on another term as chair of the MTCA, and even added to his load the chair of the New York City Bar Association's important Judiciary Committee. He had no buffer to absorb life's regular accumulation of stresses, let alone the crushing grief of losing 2 children. In 1926, the burdens proved too great, and the man of granite began to crack. Described by Clark's physician and close friend, the eminent cardiologist Paul Dudley White of Massachusetts General Hospital, as having an extraordinary interdependence of mind, body, and soul. Clark, in this case, was unable to counterbalance an anguished soul and exhausted body, even with his unusually indomitable force of mind. The 42-year-old Clark suffered a nervous breakdown, capping an unrelenting state of mental and physical exhaustion. The treatment protocol for nervous disorders in the 1920s was some variation of rest cure. Clark was prescribed a full year at a sanatorium in Kerhonkson, New York. Here, as elsewhere, wealth smoothed the edges. Clark was able to move his entire family and staff into a house on the Kerhonkson grounds for the duration of his stay. There is little record of his time there. We can judge only by the results that it was a success. It speaks of both the skill of the medical staff and the grit of the patient that Clark enjoyed the bulk of his remarkable career after this significant event. Even at a psychological ebb, Clark was still making friends. His doctor at Kerhonkson, Andrew Ford, and one of his fellow patients, Edward M. Day, a Hartford attorney, remained in close contact through their lifetimes. With a nod to the episode and dark events leading to it, Clark summarized in a midlife autobiographical sketch for Harvard that in my family life, I have been fortunate beyond measure. Our share of illnesses and sorrow has been far outweighed by our blessings. Clark returned from Kerhonkson to a hero's welcome at Root Clark in 1927. His relieved and protective partners attempted to mitigate his bent for overwork by assigning him his own law clerk. This was none other than the young and shining legal talent Henry Friendly, fresh from Harvard Law School and a year's clerkship with Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. As noted in Chapter 3, the attempt was a spectacular failure, and Clark immediately resumed his exhaustive personal work habits. While making Friendly a lifelong friend and admirer, Clark continued to drive and manage his myriad cases, projects, and activities virtually single-handedly. Among Clark's diverse legal clients in the 1920s were beer brewers and distilleries seeking relief from the 1920 Volstead Act, which instituted prohibition. The moment the measure took effect, the livelihoods of brewers and distillers came to a virtual halt. Clark was never a big drinker, but he indistinctly opposed prohibition because he saw its sheer unenforceability and related spike in criminal activity from bootlegging, speakeasies, and other illegal enterprises as poisonous to public respect for the law. It created scofflaws that it also circumvented personal responsibility, which was unwise, attempted to legislate morals, which was impossible, and turned mobsters into celebrities, which was distasteful, were likely secondary factors. An unintended consequence of Clark's prohibition stance was losing a potential presidential appointment in 1930. President Herbert Hoover was seeking a nominee for the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, a major post recently vacated by Charles Tuttle in his unsuccessful bid to become governor. Clark's law partner, Emory Buckner, held the position before Tuttle in 1925 to 1927, when word leaked out that Grenville Clark was the leading candidate. Enthusiastic articles endorsing his appointment appeared in the National Business Review and the New York Times, and letters of congratulation poured in from associates and friends. Clark was ambivalent. In a letter to one friend, he admitted, "I am not doing anything whatever to get appointed because it is just exactly even money whether I would like it or not. Every possible argument is against it, except that I have a slight hankering to do a tour of public service." Clark had been selected at least in part because he was the ideal candidate to depoliticize the appointment, given the growing public discontent with the Republican administration amid the worsening Depression. Clark was listed in the 1930 Who's Who as a Republican, but he was not seen as closely linked to the Hoover administration. Yet there was no escaping politics. Early in his discussions with the president, Clark alerted Hoover that he, Clark, was on record as opposing prohibition in correspondence with George Wickersham of the National Commission on Law Enforcement and Observance. Wickersham had asked Clark to investigate the industrial alcohol situation, meaning how to ensure that improved industrial alcohol manufacturers did not produce illegal liquor on the side. As Wickersham had requested, Clark's response outlined the basic framework in which the distilleries operated in regard to prohibition. It also made clear his distaste for the law. "I believe that the effort to continue prohibition is contributing more than any one thing to lack of respect for the law and the many evils arising from that. I think the minority in opposition is and will continue to be so great. The present law is unenforceable, a breeder of corruption to an extent outweighing the benefits which it brings." Without recanting or equivocating, Clark assured Hoover that his views were private and would not interfere with his duty to carry out all the laws of the land. Clark had raised the issue simply so that the president would not be caught off guard if it came up in what was likely to be a thorough vetting process. Hoover, a Quaker and unyielding supporter of the 18th Amendment, which with much of his political support coming from the Dries in the House and the Senate, blanched at the possibility that his dwindling political base would hold Clark's anti-prohibition stance against the president. The administration dithered for months, while the gossip uncertainty generates splashes through the press. It was an unwelcome intrusion and unaccustomed embarrassment to the very private Grenville Clark. When the impasse continued, Clark withdrew his name from consideration, citing outside obligations. A cordial but brief acknowledgement from Hoover closed the chapter. My dear Mr. Clark, I have your kind letter of October 23rd. I quite understand the situation that has arisen. I am in hopes we can press you into public service at some other point. Yours faithfully, Herbert Hoover. While the aborted nomination did not appear to leave Clark with an unquenched thirst for political appointment, a less publicized near miss with the Hoover administration did cause him serious reflection in the latter years. This was a personal appeal in 1931 from Henry L. Stimson, then Hoover's Secretary of State, who had previously served as Secretary of War under William Howard Taft. Stimson was a generation older than Clark, and the younger man had long admired Stimson's distinguished public record and steady, straightforward personality. Clark describes Stimson's unique request in a 1940 letter to his son.